We often grow comfortable with the plans we have carefully crafted for our own lives. We map out the road ahead, imagining how things will unfold, our careers, our relationships, our dreams. We convince ourselves that if we stick to the plan, everything will work out. But when God steps in, His call rarely fits neatly into our pre-written script. It disrupts, it rearranges, and sometimes it completely overturns what we thought our life would be. This disruption is not an act of cruelty or chaos. It is an act of divine love and intentionality. God sees the bigger picture, the eternal impact, and the hidden potential in us that even we cannot see. When He calls, it may come at a time when we feel most settled. We think we are exactly where we're supposed to be, and suddenly there's a stirring in our heart. Something feels different, an uneasiness, a restlessness that can't be explained by circumstances. That's often the beginning of His interruption. It's as if He's gently but firmly tapping us on the shoulder, saying, "The path you're on is good, but the one I have for you is better." This better path is not always easier. In fact, it may be more challenging, more uncertain, but it leads to a deeper fulfillment and a greater purpose than we could have imagined. The Bible is full of examples of people whose plans were disrupted by God's call. Moses planned to live out his days tending sheep in the wilderness, but God called him to stand before Pharaoh. David was content as a shepherd boy, but God called him to be king. Mary planned for a quiet life as a young bride, but God called her to carry His Son. In each case, the call didn't align with their personal timeline or expectations. It was inconvenient, it was daunting, and it was life-changing. Yet it was exactly what was needed to fulfill God's larger plan. When God's call disrupts our plans, our first instinct is often resistance. We tell Him we're not ready, not qualified, or not the right person for the job. We try to negotiate with Him, offering alternative ideas or asking Him to wait until a more convenient time. But God's timing is perfect, and His call is not based on our readiness, it's based on His purpose. The very disruption we fear may be the key to unlocking the destiny He has prepared for us. It's important to remember that God's call is not a random interruption, it's a divine appointment. He disrupts not to destroy, but to redirect. We may lose our sense of control, but we gain the security of walking in His will. And as we step into that calling, we often realize that the dreams we gave up were small in comparison to the vision He had for us. What felt like loss becomes gain, and what seemed uncertain becomes a journey of faith, adventure, and eternal significance. So when God's call collides with your carefully made plans, don't see it as a setback. See it as an invitation. He is inviting you to exchange your limited vision for His limitless one. He is pulling you out of the predictable so He can place you in the extraordinary. And though the disruption may unsettle you at first, you'll find that it leads to the very life you were created to live. His call may disrupt, but it always directs you to something far greater than you could have imagined. One of the most surprising ways God speaks into our lives is through people we never expected to be His messengers. We often imagine that divine direction will come through a pastor, a mentor, or a close friend who knows our journey well. And while God certainly uses those people, sometimes He chooses a complete stranger or someone we least anticipate to deliver His message. This is one of the ways He reminds us that His voice is not limited to our expectations. He can use anyone, anywhere, at any time to speak directly into our hearts. There is something humbling about being approached by someone who doesn't know our history, our struggles, or the secret thoughts we've carried. They might say something casual, but it lands in our spirit like an arrow of truth. It's as if God is confirming, "Yes, I see you. Yes, I know what's going on in your heart. Yes, this word is for you." We can't attribute it to coincidence because the words are too specific, too timely, and too aligned with what we've been wrestling with in private. In the Bible, God often used unexpected people to deliver important messages. Consider how he spoke to Balaam through his own donkey, or how Naaman, a military commander, was told by a young servant girl about the prophet who could heal him. Even the disciples themselves were called by Jesus in unexpected ways. Fishermen and tax collectors who were not seen as religious leaders became the ones to carry the gospel. Over and over, Scripture shows us that God does not limit his voice to those we label as qualified. He uses the willing, the available, and sometimes even the unaware to fulfill his purposes. When the call comes through an unexpected person, it often catches us off guard. We may even dismiss it at first because it doesn't come through the channels we're used to trusting. But if we pause, pray, and truly listen, we might realize that the message carries a weight and clarity that can only come from God. The delivery method may be surprising, but the source is unmistakable. Sometimes God uses unexpected people because it strips away our pride and self-reliance. If the message came from someone we respected or admired, we might attribute it to their wisdom rather than God's direction. But when it comes from someone outside our inner circle, perhaps even someone we've overlooked, it's harder to explain away. We are forced to recognize that God is the one orchestrating the moment. This also reminds us that we should never underestimate the role we might play in someone else's calling. Just as God can send a word to us through someone surprising, he can also use us to speak life into another person's journey. We may think our words are insignificant, but to the right person at the right time, they can be the confirmation they've been waiting for. The next time someone unexpected speaks a word that resonates deeply within you, don't rush past it. Test it against Scripture, seek God in prayer, and be open to the possibility that he is speaking to you in a way you didn't anticipate. God's methods may surprise us, but his message is always intentional. And when he chooses an unexpected messenger, it is often because he wants to ensure we know without a doubt that it is his voice calling us, not the voice of human influence. When God calls someone into a specific purpose, he often confirms that call more than once. This isn't because he is uncertain or needs to persuade himself, it's because he knows we are human. We doubt, we second, guess, and we sometimes question whether what we heard was truly from him. Repeated confirmations are God's way of reinforcing his message, so that, over time, our faith in his direction grows stronger and our excuses begin to fade. These confirmations can come in many different forms. Sometimes they arrive through Scripture, verses that keep appearing no matter where we read. Other times they come through sermons that speak directly to the situation we've been praying about, even when the preacher had no idea what we were going through. We might hear the same phrase, the same story, or the same instruction from multiple unrelated sources. At first, we might think it's just coincidence, but eventually we realize the pattern is too consistent to ignore. Repeated confirmations serve another important purpose. They separate God's voice from our own imagination. In moments of strong emotion, we can mistake our own desires for God's will. But when the same message comes to us again and again, especially from different directions, it becomes clear that this is not just something we made up in our minds. It's God patiently, lovingly, and firmly guiding us toward the path he has prepared. In the Bible, God gave repeated confirmations to many of his servants. Gideon, for example, asked God for multiple signs to be sure he was truly being called to lead Israel into battle. Each time, God graciously responded, confirming the call so that Gideon could move forward in faith. The Apostle Peter also received repeated visions and instructions before he understood that God was calling him to take the gospel to the Gentiles. These examples show us that God does not grow impatient with our need for reassurance. Instead, He meets us where we are and strengthens our confidence in His plan. These confirmations are not only about clarity, they are also about timing. Sometimes God gives us a glimpse of our calling long before He intends for us to walk in it. The repeated signs along the way remind us to stay ready and to trust that the moment will come. They keep the vision alive in our hearts so that when the opportunity finally arrives, we can step into it without hesitation. It's important to note that repeated confirmations are not meant to be a crutch for disobedience. We can't use them as an excuse to delay forever, saying, "I'll wait until I get just one more sign." At some point, the confirmations are meant to move us from doubt to action. God strengthens our faith not so we can keep sitting in comfort, but so we can stand up and obey. If you find yourself experiencing the same theme, the same message, or the same prompting over and over again, pay attention. That's often God's way of saying, "I haven't changed my mind. This is still what I want you to do." Don't ignore it, and don't dismiss it as coincidence. Each confirmation is a gift of grace, reminding you that you are seen, known, and called. And when the time comes to step out, you will go forward not on shaky ground, but on the firm foundation of a call that has been confirmed by the one who never speaks in vain. When we think of God speaking, we often imagine dramatic moments, a burning bush, a thunderous voice from the clouds, or a blinding light from heaven. And yes, God has spoken in those ways before, but more often, His voice comes in a gentle, quiet way that still manages to pierce through the noise of our lives. It's not always loud, but it is unshakable. Once you've truly heard Him, you can't forget it, and you can't ignore it. The prophet Elijah experienced this on Mount Horeb. He stood waiting for God's voice and witnessed a powerful wind, an earthquake, and a fire, but the Lord was not in any of them. Then came a gentle whisper, and that was where God's voice was found. This story reminds us that God does not always speak through force or spectacle. Sometimes He chooses the softness of a whisper because He wants us to draw near, to lean in, and to listen with our hearts rather than just our ears. A gentle voice can be more powerful than a loud one because it speaks directly to the soul. It bypasses the defenses we put up, the busyness of our minds, and the distractions of our environment. This is why people often describe hearing God's voice not as an audible sound, but as a deep knowing, a conviction that settles into their spirit and refuses to leave. Even if the message is brief, it carries a weight and certainty that no amount of doubt can shake. The gentleness of God's voice also reflects His character. He is not in the business of forcing obedience through intimidation. Instead, He invites us to respond out of love and trust. His gentle voice respects our freedom to choose, but it carries such truth and authority that ignoring it feels impossible. It's as if the message embeds itself into the core of who we are, and no matter how much we try to push it aside, it comes back again and again, reminding us of His call. At times, God's voice comes as a quiet nudge, an inner prompting to reach out to someone, to take a step of faith, or to walk away from something harmful. Other times, it comes as a phrase or scripture that echoes in our minds at unexpected moments. Even in its softness, the message remains steady. We might try to reason it away, but it lingers until we choose to respond. That's what makes it unshakable. This gentle yet firm way of speaking also trains us to cultivate stillness. We can't hear a whisper if we're constantly surrounded by noise, whether that's the noise of busyness, entertainment, or our own anxious thoughts. God's voice invites us to slow down, to create space in our hearts where His words can take root. And once they do, those words become anchors in times of doubt, guiding us back to His truth. If you've experienced God's gentle yet unshakable voice, you know it's unlike anything else. It doesn't shout to overpower you. It speaks in a way that calls you deeper. It doesn't leave you uncertain. It leaves you with a peace that surpasses understanding, even if the path ahead is unclear. And it never fades completely, because what God plants in your spirit stays until it has accomplished the purpose for which He sent it. So don't overlook the quiet moments. Pay attention to the whispers that refuse to leave. The gentleness of God's voice is not a sign of weakness. It is a sign of His perfect strength, His unchanging nature, and His desire to speak in a way that reaches your heart, not just your ears. And when you hear it, you'll know, this is the voice you were made to follow. When God calls someone, He is not scanning the earth for the most talented, the most educated, or the most experienced. He is looking for the one who is willing to say, "Here I am, Lord, send me." In God's kingdom, availability matters far more than ability. This is because His work is not accomplished by human strength alone. It is accomplished through His power working in and through those who are willing to obey. Our human instinct is to measure worthiness by qualifications. We think that to be used by God, we must have the perfect background, a flawless track record, and all the right skills. But Scripture repeatedly shows that God's criteria are very different from ours. Moses stuttered, yet God chose him to speak to Pharaoh. David was a shepherd boy, overlooked by his own family, yet God chose him to be king. The disciples were fishermen, tax collectors, and ordinary men, yet Jesus entrusted them with the mission of spreading the gospel to the world. None of them were called because they were the most qualified. They were called because they were willing. This truth is both humbling and liberating. It's humbling because it reminds us that no matter how gifted we are, our abilities alone are not enough to fulfill God's purposes. It's liberating because it means our weaknesses and shortcomings do not disqualify us from being used by Him. God is not limited by what we lack. He is able to supply everything we need when we step out in faith. In fact, He often chooses those who seem least likely precisely so that His power is made more visible. As the Apostle Paul wrote, God chose the foolish things of the world to shame the wise, so that no one may boast before Him. Availability requires trust. Saying yes to God's call often means stepping into the unknown, doing things we feel unprepared for, and relying on Him in ways we never have before. It is the posture of a surrendered heart, one that says, "Lord, I don't have it all together, but I am willing to go where you send me and do what you ask." This willingness opens the door for God to equip us as we go. The calling may be bigger than our abilities, but it is never bigger than His. One of the dangers we face is allowing feelings of inadequacy to keep us from responding. We might think, "I'm not ready," or "I'm not the right person for this." But those thoughts place the focus on what we can do instead of what God can do through us. The truth is, we will never feel completely ready for the assignments God gives, and that's by design, because if we could handle everything in our own strength, we would not need Him. When we make ourselves available, we are placing our lives in the hands of the Master, trusting that He can shape and use us in ways we never imagined. He may call us to serve in our communities, speak His truth in difficult places, or take steps of faith that seem impossible. But as we walk in obedience, we will discover that His strength is made perfect in our weakness. In the end, God is not asking for perfection. He is asking for surrender. He is not looking for those who have every skill, but for those who are willing to be vessels for His work. Our abilities will grow over time, but the first step is simply to be available. When we give Him our yes, He takes care of the rest. And when the task is done, it will be clear to everyone that it was not our ability that made it possible, but the power of the God who called us. When we are in the middle of a calling, especially one that disrupts our plans and stretches our faith, It can be hard to understand why God is leading us in a certain direction. The path may feel uncertain, the challenges may be overwhelming, and the sacrifices may seem costly. In those moments, we often ask questions: why now? Why me? Why this way? But with time, as we walk in obedience and see the pieces fall into place, we begin to look back and realize that every step had a purpose. What once seemed confusing begins to make sense in the light of hindsight. Looking back reveals that God's hand was at work even when we couldn't see it. We notice how certain events, both good and difficult, shaped our character, prepared us for challenges, and positioned us for opportunities we never could have arranged on our own. That closed door we once cried over may have been the very thing that kept us from harm. That unexpected delay might have been God's way of aligning us with the right people at the right time. The detours that frustrated us may have been the exact training ground for the ministry or mission He was preparing us to fulfill. In Scripture, Joseph's story is a powerful example of this truth. When he was sold into slavery by his brothers, falsely accused and thrown into prison, nothing about his situation made sense. But years later, when he was elevated to a position of authority in Egypt and able to save countless lives during a famine, Joseph could say to his brothers, "You meant evil against me, but God meant it for good." Looking back allowed him to see that every trial was part of a bigger plan that he could not have understood at the time. The process of looking back not only gives us clarity, but also deepens our trust in God. When we recognize that He has been faithful before, we can face future challenges with greater confidence. We stop seeing life as a series of random events and start seeing it as a carefully woven tapestry where even the dark threads have a purpose. Each season, whether joyful or painful, becomes part of the larger story God is writing in our lives. Sometimes we also realize that the strange way He called us into a role or ministry was intentional. The unusual circumstances, the repeated confirmations, the unexpected people, these were not accidental details. They were markers along the journey, reminders that this calling was from Him and that He was in control all along. This understanding often fills us with gratitude because we see that He chose not the easiest route, but the one that would transform us into the person we needed to be for the work ahead. Looking back also gives us a testimony to share. When we see how God's purpose unfolded in our own lives, we can encourage others who are in the middle of uncertainty. We can say with confidence, "I didn't understand it then, but now I see His hand in every step." Our stories become living proof that God works all things together for good for those who love Him and are called according to His purpose. So while we may not always understand the why in the present, we can trust that the day will come when it will all make sense. And when that day comes, we will see that His plan was never random, His timing was never late, and His purpose was always worth the journey. Looking back will not only reveal His purpose, it will remind us that He has been guiding us every step of the way.